Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Shakespeare Hour Live. Great to see you all, and thank you for spending your Wednesday evening with us. How wonderful to spend another episode together, mulling over the genius and the legacy of Shakespeare. Well, before I get started, I want to thank the generous sponsors of this episode of Shakespeare Hour Live, and they are Barbara Harmon and William Kane. Barbara and William, thank you. It's wonderful that you're making this gesture and making tonight's show possible. The Shakespeare Hour is produced as part of our larger artistic initiative called Shakespeare Everywhere, which is generously supported by the Beach Street Foundation. I am once again coming to you live from Rectortown Methodist Church here in rural Virginia, although I do have a new backdrop this evening, which you might have spotted, loaned from the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. So my thanks to them. Keen as I am on variety. Let me now introduce our wonderful panelists. Let's go through one by one. Well, first of all, I'd like to introduce esteemed actor Chuk Iwuji, who played Buckingham in Sam Mendes' 2011 production of Richard III. Chuk, are you there?
I am here. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for coming on the show. Can I ask where you are this evening?
I'm actually in Harlem, New York, which is where I've been spending the lockdown. So, yeah, that's me.
Wow. Has it been an intense place to be during this period?
You know, for the first time in New York, you could hear birdsong because it got so quiet outside my apartment. And, you know, I'm a few blocks from Central Park, Riverside Park. I think one of the things this whole period has allowed us to do is to take pause. And in New York, you're always walking somewhere. You're always going to something. So it's been really interesting where you just go on a walk. And I'm really enjoying the quiet. And so, yes, it hasn't been too bad. I mean, Whole Foods down the road stayed open and we've stayed safe. So, but we are going away soon. We needed just a change of scene in a couple of weeks. But it's been wonderful. Thank you for asking.
Good. And let me ask one other question. Have you been missing Shakespeare, Chuck?
Do you know, I have been wrapped up in a lot of Shakespeare during this period. I launched a program of myself, of my own, called Bounded in a Nutshell, that I used to raise money for theater artists that were out of work, which brought on some guests, Q&As, and then we talked, and then they led masterclasses with students and all donation based. So I have been surrounded by Shakespeare. On Monday, I'm going back to doing Henry VI thing for Red Bull Theatre. I'm doing something on Hamlet on Friday. So no, Shakespeare is a bit like
you have plenty of Shakespeare. Well, thanks,
Michael Corleone said every time I try to get out, they drag me back in. You know, that's what
good.
It's like.
Good. Well, thanks for being dragged in.
Thanks.
Wonderful. And my next guest tonight is a friend, the scholar Hester Lees-Jeffries. And I'm very excited because Hester is our first guest in our series to be joining us live from the United Kingdom. She's a member of Cambridge University and a fellow of St. Catherine's College, where I, in fact, studied. So it's a bit of a kind of homecoming reunion for me. Hester, are you there?
I'm here, Simon. It's lovely to see you.
Oh, it's lovely to see you, Hester. And can I ask, what time is it in Cambridge, United Kingdom right now?
It's just after midnight, so quite a late one.
Okay, good. And so I hope you've had a coffee or two or a stiff drink of some kind?
Well, it's been a very hot day here by UK standards, so I'm on the water this evening.
Okay, good. Well, I'm pleased to hear it. And looking forward to talking more shortly. Welcome, Hester. And finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce Gregg Mozgala, who among many roles has played Richard in Teenage Dick, a modern adaptation of Richard III by Michael Liu at the Public Theatre in New York. Hello, Gregg.
Hello, Simon. How are you?
Oh, I'm really well, thanks. Great to see you. Where are you tonight?
I'm also in Harlem, New York.
My goodness, are you neighbors with?
Chuck, maybe we could do a social distance hang before you take off.
Great.
Yeah, totally. He's giving me a thumbs up. Yeah.
Okay, great. It's all about bringing people together, the Shakespeare Hour.
Right, that's right.
This is terrific. And how's the lockdown been for you, Gregg?
You know, it's been, I wouldn't say it hasn't been intense, but I have, my wife is a New York City public school teacher. We have a son who's going to be 2 in August. So we both have been working from home, whatever that means when you have a toddler. But it's been trying at times, but there have been these really incredible moments of domestic bliss. And I think, as Chuk said, like rediscovering, I feel like nature has reemerged, but being able to really explore New York, like get to parks, have this wonderful, wonderful time with my son and family, which I wouldn't have had without these extreme events.
Wow. Okay, well, thank you. There is a silver lining somewhere, and it's great to hear you articulate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, finally, of course, it's time to introduce my co-host, Drew Lichtenberg, resident dramaturg at Shakespeare Theatre Company. Drew, hello, welcome.
Hello, Simon.
How are you?
I am doing just fine. And before we get started with our conversation, I want to thank all of our guests for being here. I also want to remind everyone watching from their own homes about a few features. If you're tuning in for the first time, you will notice that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And that we've already received a question, so keep those questions coming. We're going to be answering them over the course of the next hour. And if you want to chat to everyone else who's watching the session, telling them where in the world you are, if you are indeed in Harlem or in DC or in the United Kingdom, along with Hester, let us all know. The theme of tonight's episode is what we've called the Ascent and the Descent. And the play we're talking about is Richard III. Of course, we mean the political ascent and descent, although maybe it has other meanings. But we chose this play to discuss because it's the one in which Shakespeare sort of depicts the rise and fall of a king in its most panoramic form. Indeed, he even starts depicting it in the latter part of Henry VI, Part 3, which Richard also appears in. Richard III, most scholars date to 1592, 1593. It's a sort of chaotic 2-year period in Shakespeare's career. The theaters were closed due to plague in June of 1592 for almost 2 entire years. If you can imagine, we've had lockdown for about 3 months, so almost 6 times as long as we've been in lockdown. And by the end of it in 1594, the Lord Chamberlain's men are formed, and Shakespeare is one of the founding members. So Richard III is an early play. It's a great play. It has a lot of great bits in it. It has that famous opening soliloquy, perhaps the most famous opening of any play in Shakespeare. For those who don't remember the play, it's also a play filled with plots, with schemes, with murder. Richard contrives to kill his brother, the Duke of Clarence. He kills his cousins, the 2 young princes in the Tower. He kills Hastings, the Lord Chamberlain. He kills Queen Elizabeth's family in the Tower. It's really a series of murders on Richard's way up to power, most of which seem to be distortions of the historical record. We may have some Ricardians at home watching. We're looking forward to any questions you may have or comments you wish to share. But what's interesting about this play specifically is the way in which the artificiality of it has become true over time. If you look at the 20th century, the 19th century, the 400 years since Shakespeare wrote the play, it seems to be more accurate in a way than real history. It seems to predict a lot of what has happened. Indeed, it continues to happen in our own contemporary political world. So the core question that we're going to examine tonight is, how does Shakespeare depict the rise and fall of Richard III and of England? And what can we learn from this play today? I thought we would start, Hester, since you have stayed up so late. It's only appropriate to start with you.
Thanks, Drew. I wanted to start off by thinking about patterns and turning points as a way of approaching this play. And some possible models that we might use would include perhaps thinking about Richard as a tragic hero, so using the classical model put forward by Aristotle. And in some of the earliest versions that are printed of this play, the play is actually called a tragedy. But Aristotle's Poetics only provided one of the models of tragedy that was available to Shakespeare and his audience, and it actually probably wasn't the best known one. We might think about another model of tragedy, which is in a way both older and newer, medieval ideas of tragedy based on the Wheel of Fortune. We might suggest what goes up must come down. As soon as Richard gains the throne, it's actually game over, no matter what he does. But I want to have my cake and eat it too a bit in relation to this play. I want to think about these large patterns of inevitability, of falling, but also about turning points, the moments where the relationship between Richard and his audience changes. Now, of course, Richard III stands alone brilliantly, but it's the end of a cycle of history plays, the three parts of Henry VI, telling the story of what we'd now call the Wars of the Roses. And it's right there, as Drew said, at the beginning of Shakespeare's career. If you come to Richard III after the prequels, as it were, then the up and down nature of kingship, the number of times that the crown changes hands, really shows this, that to gain the crown is to begin the process of losing it. But an early modern audience in the 1590s might also think about the play as having a larger cosmic pattern, that it's a battle between good and evil. Richard talks about himself as a vice, as a Machiavel, but he's also a straightforwardly demonic figure. He's the boar, the toad, the spider. He's the serpent in the garden. He's the dragon, Satan, who has to be killed by Richmond as St. George. And in these larger patterns, Richard has to fall. It's not actually down to anything that he does, any choice, any flaw. It's the way that history has to work. And in Christian terms, one of the play's patterns is a fortunate fall, like the fall of Adam and Eve in the Bible. Richard's corruption, his sin, his fall, enables the recovery and the healing and the redemption of the nation. But there are still turning points, and I want to think about a couple of them, not at the level of plot or even character, but what we might think of as dramatic construction. Richard III is really unusual for Shakespeare in that it opens with a soliloquy by the main character. That's Marlowe's technique, it's not Shakespeare's. Shakespeare specialises in, let us overhear the dialogue between two otherwise minor characters. But here, that opening soliloquy creates intimacy as we share that incredible now of the dramatic present, as he talks to us. As Iago will do a decade later, Richard tells us that we're with him, we're the clever ones here. Everybody else is stupid. We know what he's up to. He's going to tell us what he's going to do next. He's funny, he's self-deprecating, he's outrageous. But that intimacy, that flattery has to be broken. And one key moment here is the killing of the young princes. And it's really cleverly done, but also really slippery. Tyrrell, who organises the murder, is really badly shaken by the way it's reported to him. He doesn't do it himself, he gets a couple of lowlifes to do it. And this is what they say to him, or this is Tyrrell saying this is what it was like. Oh, thus lay the gentle babes, thus girdling one another with their alabaster innocent arms. Their lips were 4 red roses on a stalk, with which in their summer beauty kissed each other. A book of prayers on their pillow lay. Now this sounds like a Victorian painting or a waxwork. It's very sentimental, it's very beautiful. It's actually nothing like the princes who've appeared in the play. They are seriously annoying. But it has to be distanced. It has to be kind of emotionally overloaded. And part of the problem, and maybe it's a challenge that Shakespeare sets himself, is that Richmond, the kind of hero who has to win because history, is incredibly boring. He has had a charisma bypass. If you know the old Olivier film, you'll notice that all his lines are cut pretty much, and in exchange he gets a really, really bad blonde wig. It's not really an adequate compensation. And so the orations by Richmond and Richard before the Battle of Bosworth are really significant. The Richard that we've seen at the beginning of the play should win this speech battle absolutely hands down, because he wins all the language games. But Richmond gets to do a kind of proto-Henry V. This is the end of Richmond's battle oration. For me, the ransom of my bold attempt shall be this cold corpse on the earth's cold face, But if I thrive, the gain of my attempt, the least of you shall share his part thereof. Sound drums and trumpets boldly and cheerfully, God and St. George, Richmond and victory. But Richard doesn't get that. He gives a smutty, vulgar, rabble-rousing speech, and it concludes like this. Shall these enjoy our lands, lie with our wives, ravish our daughters? And then he's interrupted. There's a drum. The battle started without him. He doesn't even get to finish his speech. It's not just that his last lines, that famous missing horse, are potentially ridiculous. He doesn't get a dying speech. He doesn't get a last intimate soliloquy. His rhetorical power, that intimate bond with the audience, gone.
So many things to respond to, Hester, and I think one of the big things that you've put your finger on is this dichotomy in the play between this kind of Christian cosmology, the redemption of the country of England, the purgation of this demonic figure, and yet the theatrical anti-Christian or amoral interest in Richard, who is really entertaining and really funny and keeps talking to the audience, and we like him in some kind of weird way, and we root for him until we don't. And I think that this is a very Shakespearean thing, that at the beginning of his career he is animating and dramatizing. Chuk, how do you answer this question of Richard and his rise and fall in the play?
I think it's a lot of those. I think Hester hit the nail on the head. Is that I always feel with Richard that it should work so powerfully at the beginning that you should be seduced. A bit like I think Lady Anne represents a lot of us in the audience with Richard. That when it flips, around the time in the play when he stops talking to us as Confederates, as companions, we should feel slightly dirty because we've really enjoyed this guy. And Shakespeare understands the power of despots. I mean, you think of them, Idi Amin, Gaddafi, Stalin, all these guys, when they first popped up, hell, Mussolini, and they were charismatic, they were charming, they were funny, they were goofballs till they became really dangerous. And I think for Richard, the rise, it's funny, Hester referred, and you have referred to Henry VI, part 3, but there's a passage I want to read, which is a bit cheeky of me because I'm reading early, but that sort of describes him, because one of the things that's really entertaining about him is that he knows what he is, and he never denies that. And there's something seductive about someone who can say that. I would rather someone who said, I'm completely messed up, mate, with a smile, and I go, you know what, you're ready to say that. And he uses that every time. Anyway, the passage I wanted to read, and then we can talk once I don't run out of time, was that, so this is from Henry VI, part 3, act 5. So this is when we're meeting a young Gloucester as he's plotting his way up to the throne, the guy we'll see in Richard III. And he goes, I that have neither pity, love, nor fear, have often heard my mother say, I came into the world with my legs forward. The midwife wondered and the women cried, oh, Jesus, bless us, he is born with teeth. And so I was, which plainly signified that I should snarl and bite and play the dog. Then since the heavens have shaped my body so, let hell make crooked my mind to answer. I have no father. I am like no father. I have no brother. I am like no brother. And this word love, which graybeards call divine, be resident in men like one another, but not in me. I am myself alone. It's almost Machiavellian. It's beyond. It's this thing that this is the. And he uses his mother a lot and his birth, and the fact he never had a chance from the start. So Richard is a survivor. Don't forget, Gloucester's a great fighter in the Henry VI's. He comes this snarling guy that has this little, but he fights. He upholds the kingdom. And yet he never has a chance. And then we see with the Duchess, with his mom, she calls him a toad, the devil, you know. And I think we see it again with Lady Anne, is that this thing of, are they really letting me get away with this? And, you know, when he says that, and I know friends to back my suit at all, but the plain devil and dissembling looks, and yet to win her, all the world to nothing. Ha! It's this driving force. And I worry about trying to give a logic to why he is who he is. I think sometimes with this guy, power is seductive to all of us. Some of us are just too frightened to go after it. He isn't, even against all the odds. And I think that's what the rise is. It's like, it's there, the crown is there. So why don't I just go for it? And I think it simplifies to that. And at the same time, it's as simple and yet as unknowing as that with Richard. But there's a lot of enjoyment along the way, until the flip isn't actually when he becomes, it is when he becomes king, but the flip is actually when Tyrrell comes and tells about those kids dying, and the laughs sort of die away. You know, and I think it's Dighton, Tyrrell says, Dighton says to him, we smothered the most replenished sweet work of nature, that from the prime creation ere she framed, we killed the most perfect thing for this guy. And the joke is over. And then we realize he was never supposed to be a king. A bit like we're realizing now with certain of our leaders. So yeah, that's my thoughts about him. And that's the fascination about him, is that someone can be so honest about who he is. A lot of characters in Shakespeare, Macbeth has the famous, you know, I am so steeped in blood, I can't go back. They have a moment, but Richard continuously tells us who the hell he is and revels in it. And we still accept him till innocents are killed, you know. Anyway, that's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, he's really fun until he completely stops being fun.
Yeah, until it stops being fun, yeah.
And there's something despotic that Shakespeare understands about the despotic personality, where their rebellion against the world, their self-fashioning in this quasi-existential way is thrilling until we realize things like the social contract get frayed and break apart.
Yeah, yeah, and social contract in that time, I mean, don't forget the Tudors are in power, and there's a lot of people that don't feel that should be the case when he's writing this. So what is power? Who's legitimate and not, you know? Is there some dodgy bloodline that goes back to John of Gaunt? Does that give you the right to be king now? You know, there are all these questions that are being asked about, you know, why people change sides so often, you know.
Gregg, as Chuk was reading his passage, you started mouthing along to it. It seems like you know that intimately well, and know the role of Richard intimately well, even though you've played him in Teenage Dick, which is an adaptation. How do you relate to this conversation about Richard and his identity?
Well, it's been, I mean, thank you for everything that's been added to the conversation so far. That is one, that passage that Chuk read is one of my favorite speeches of Richard's, and I think in the entire canon. I hadn't intended to do this, but you ask about identity, and I would be remiss if not to bring disability into the equation. So I'm disabled myself. I was born with cerebral palsy, and I'm fascinated by the archetype of Richard, the fact that as arguably one of the most famous characters in Western dramatic literature, he is a disabled figure. And I'm fascinated by this Christian ideal that, a worldview that Hester brought up, because, you know, I'm not a theologian or anything, but I know in my own studies, like there was a theologian called Gregory of Tours who equated disability with sinfulness, with the devil. So I'd be really interested in hearing more about like how his physicality ties into the Elizabethan worldview, and how even 500 years on, we might still have those very antiquated views of disability, and how we associate otherness or prodigiousness with being dirty, evil, less than. I think those are just fascinating questions for me, and things that I don't think can be discounted. So I'm just curious by it all. So I think like that is who he is. So I feel like Richard is, from my point of view, Richard is always telling us who we are in a reaction to how he is always being told who he is, as the bottled spider, as the monster, as this thing that this lump, this thing that nobody wanted, when he is an extremely capable fighter. He has a great mind. You know, he is, I think, the best in his line, but he is held, and he says, since people see me this way, essentially, in that speech that Chuk mentioned, I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me, so I can't pull up the exact words, but it's like, basically, you see me this way. He says it in the first soliloquy of Richard III also, like, and in Henry VI, part 3. It's just, I feel like the reaction is, I am this way because that is all that I'm allowed to be. So I am going to respond and rebel against that. And so his relationship with the audience is essential. And there's a late, great disabled playwright named John Beluso, who said that to be disabled is to always be on stage, because you are always in relation to an audience. When you are walking down the street, when you are going to the store, you know, the way I navigate through the world is very different from, you know, say a non-disabled, able-bodied, normative person, right? So just my feelers rubbed, you know? So I think that is, I just find that fascinating. I don't have any answers to it, and I'm not trying to sort of elevate that in any way, but it is an essential part of his humanity. And I think that's the most important thing with Richard. As people try and take him on or study him, it's not, I guess from an actor point of view, like not how disabled can I make this person, but how human can I make him? Because when we see him, as he enters in part 2 and part 3, he is a brother, he is a member of a family, he is fighting for his family and his cause. I mean, he really, really believes this stuff. So all those essential things, I think, cannot be discounted. And I just, yeah, I love the conversation around the sort of sketch or the model of the despot. All these, I don't know if it's just happening because what's happening in the United States and who our president is, but yes, it's all fun and games until, like, we're having this conversation writ large as a society. Where is the line? Where is the line for this man, right? For his enablers, for his sycophants and whatnot, and how much can we possibly take before society breaks? And, you know, either we go all the way with him or into a new era.
You know, it's interesting, Simon, we did not plan this, but the last 3 weeks we have discussed The Merchant of Venice, Othello, and now Richard III. And the theme of the social outcast has come up again and again, and how Shakespeare, in some ways uniquely for his time, although as Hester points out, he's inspired by Marlowe, who similarly is drawn to the outcast, although he treats those characters in very different ways. There's something about Shakespeare where he gravitates to these figures, maybe because of their dramatic potential, but then he fills them with humanity. He brings them to life in a way.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating is it's a very rich study, as we're realizing, when people who've been in one place move into the center and move into a position of power. And they have a certain identity or set of experiences that make them very, very particular and very, in the case of Richard III, very extreme. I find that line extraordinarily prescient. I am myself alone. It's as if somehow there's also in Richard a lack of empathy that finally makes him capable of this, as you say, Gregg, moment, which we've all spoken about tonight, of the line that cannot be crossed is crossed, the death of children. And clearly for Shakespeare, you feel Shakespeare's own outrage, as if when a character does that, he can no longer give them wonderful speeches, amazing rhetoric, seductive jokes. It's like he, as a writer, kind of intervenes and says, enough. And I think it's so right. We can't speak about this play without some resonance with the current moment. And I think this question, as you say, Gregg, of when is the line crossed in a modern ruler is a very urgent one. And I think that, yeah, I'm certainly grappling with that question, as I think we all are. True.
There's a question from Simon, not Simon Godwin, but a viewer named Simon who identifies himself as a Richardian, not a Ricardian, I should note. I was wrong in my use of the term. Simon is curious about the power of propaganda in this play, or how the play, I think, functions as propaganda. It epitomizes the cliche that history is written by the winners, Simon's comment. I know that Sir Thomas More's book on Richard was a source for the play. How does the vilification of Richard by Shakespeare legitimize the House of the Tudors, who Richmond is Henry VII, the first Tudor king, who arguably were founded on illegitimate grounds? Hester, I wonder if you want to respond to this volley.
Hi, Simon. That's a really interesting question, and I can't say that I wasn't dreading it. I think we all know that these aren't neutral plays, but I suppose I want to push back a bit at the idea that they are just simple propaganda either, because we have to remember that Shakespeare is writing for the commercial stage. The bottom line is the bottom line. And so what he is writing is fabulous entertainment. Now, that could be serving the ends of a particular regime, but it is also very much serving the balance sheet. He's writing a great part for Richard Burbage. He's following up on the success of the Henry VI plays and the great fashion for history plays. So yes, we can read it now as propaganda. We can read Henry V as propaganda. But I think it's not ever as simple as that this is not state-sponsored drama. This is cracking entertainment written by a playwright who's really getting into his stride. So I think I've dodged your question there, Simon, but I hope it's maybe complicated the picture in some interesting ways.
And really the big question that a number of people seem to be asking is why Shakespeare diverges from the historical record. We know that he does diverge from the historical record, not just in this play, but again and again. And the question of why, I think you suggest one very convincing reason, which is that he was not in the business of historical fidelity. He was in the business of popular entertainment, which in a way has a totally different aim and goal, right? The idea of the people who wrote Camelot the musical were not interested in being faithful to King Arthur. And Chuk and Gregg, you guys as actors, I'm interested, do you ever go back to the historical record, or do you start with Shakespeare's play?
I don't. I'm certainly one of the actors in general that on anything, just about anything, I don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. And I think that certainly with Shakespeare, I mean, I played Henry VI, and Henry VI, if you think he's somewhat powerless in the history, well, in the way we view power, I mean, in real life, he wasn't even as interesting as the Shakespearean version. So I wasn't interested in a lot of the historical Henry. I was interested in the Henry that Shakespeare gave me. And I think that it's similar, and going back to that question about Richard, is that you have a playwright wanting to write a popular play for his lead actor. He knows that if he's gonna do that and deal with politics in this very troubling time, because of Protestants, Catholics, Tudors, non-Lancasters, all that stuff. So he's doing a real balancing act, you know what I mean? And I think in a lot of his plays, I find that Shakespeare does a lot of, he sits on the fence a lot. He serves up something and then he undercuts it straight away. So I, as an actor, always start with the script version that's in front of me. And if the historical stuff can help the portrayal of what the playwright has written, then great. If it gets in the way, I'm not interested in banging my head against a wall when there is a very rich version of that story to be told. Then I let Hesters of this world and audience members debate that between themselves while I have a fabulous time playing the actual character, you know?
Simon, we are at what I call our soft interval, our 30 minutes past the hour, or on the hour, as it were. Usually we take this time to update people on future installments of the Shakespeare Hour. Do you have any exciting news?
I'm always taken by surprise in this moment, Drew, because I'm always so gripped by what our guests are saying that I lose track about my own responsibilities in this moment. But yes, we have extended the Shakespeare Hour through July. Here are the episodes that are coming up. I hope we're going to show you a graphic right now. Here we go. We've got many exciting. Yes, it's working. This is good. We've got many exciting guests coming up. Sir Jonathan Bate is joining us next week. Maureen Dowd, the New York Times columnist, Harry Lennox, the actor, and Francesca Zambello, the great opera director, are all standing by in the wings to join us. And the Phoenix Fund, of course, directly supports the Shakespeare Hour. And if you continue to enjoy the program, we'll hope you'll register to join us for future episodes and even consider making a gift to the Phoenix Fund today. And you can learn more about that all on our website. Thank you so much. Interval over. Back to you, Drew.
And I have some questions for you, Gregg. One from Ju Young, who's watching. I always found Richard to be more of a character created by the cold and nasty environment he was surrounded in. His view and character are distorted from the beginning by the discrimination he has experienced. And I find the play compelling and quintessential, considering how we even now live in an era of discrimination, as I think you were saying before the break. Do you think he's portrayed as a victim as well in the play? How come I find him more to be pitied than disgusted? And there's a similar question from viewer Barry. What are the different features you believe should be conveyed through Richard's physical deformity? Which I think is a choice that every actor has to kind of decide with the director when they're performing the play.
Right. Wow. Okay, I guess I'll take those a little one of the. I'm sorry. The first question was about like, is he a victim? Is he a victim of circumstance essentially? Right?
Yeah. How much does his environment determine who he is, rather than his own will or self-determination?
Well, I think those things are at odds. I think those things are directly at odds. I think his environment and his self-determination are that is his. That I think that is true to his core. I think he is, in my experience, he is. That is why he is always trying to show, I am doing this intentionally. I am showing you. I know. I think he puts on. He's an excellent manipulator. So there are many instances throughout the play where he plays the victim intentionally. And in my own life, I know as in the interest of self-survival, I learn how to manipulate people because I'm at a visible physical disadvantage, but again, I think his humanity is everything. Simon, you mentioned this great line, I am myself alone. Right. And I'm just having this thought now, having talked about it. But again, my neurology and my physicality is different than anyone in my family. I don't move like my father. I don't move like my brother. I don't move like my mother. There is something, I think that line, maybe it's just because of my own experience and I am personalizing that. But I think that, again, that strikes me as a very, very powerful line related to his physicality and his circumstance and everything that has led up to that. So I think, which would maybe lead me into the second question, in how you sort of portray Richard. I think oftentimes when people, just in general, when people want to, people may be experiencing Richard for the first time when they see him in this play as he enters, right? And maybe this is true when people experience disability in the real world, but that person is not disabled the moment we meet them. They have had a lifetime of adapting to the world, and that is hostile to them, both structurally, both verbally, both in myriad ways, right? So I think Richard is an incredibly, incredibly, incredibly strong person. He's had to overcompensate. He's had to develop other tools and tactics in ways that maybe his brother hasn't. His brother, one of the first in that great soliloquy in Henry VI-3 is like, I, Edward, will use women honorably. I wish he would like break into dust or whatever. It was like the first line. That speech talks about how it's easy for I'm paraphrasing horribly, but my brother is a ladies' man, you know, like it's so easy for him. What if I did that? People would laugh at me. It would be ridiculous. Even if I had all the money in the world and put on the finest clothes and like all that stuff, I cannot get rid of this, you know? And that's just true for myself as an actor. Every role I ever play will have every character I ever play will have cerebral palsy. There's nothing I can do about that, right? So I just think I think, you know, I don't have to really choose. All I have to do is move on stage, and that's how Richard manifests for me. Like if it is a non-disabled actor playing Richard, I think you have so much fodder to do, you know, but I would just remember that he has spent a lifetime figuring out how to move how he moves with grace, ease, and flow, even though it may look incredibly difficult, right? So how you would integrate that into performance, I don't know. That's up to the individual actor, but that's just my take on it.
And yet, I think all of that is very true. And yet to push back, when I hear Richard say, I am myself alone, I think, that's right, that's how I feel. And I think this is what's so interesting about the character. And I'm interested to hear from Chuk and Hester on this. Richard is very sympathetic, and yet at the same time, he's lying. He says, I have no brothers, but we see his brothers in the play, right? And he woos Lady Anne, and then he turns around immediately and says, I have her, but I'll not keep her long. So there's a weird way in which his experience is presented in a way that's universalized, and yet is also turned inside out, where it's shown to be deceptive or illusionary.
True. Can I just say, he's just killed a king, which is a great sin, right? Wouldn't that be considered a great sin against God to kill a king? I don't know, but I think he has to do that. He has to, in order to do what he needs to do, he has to disavow everything that he knows and disassociate, right?
Well, that's very interesting, I think, Gregg, if I may come in with that, because sorry, I know Hester, but I think this is a very interesting question about disavowal, isn't it? There's the kind of moral, emotional disavowal, which seems to be what's required for people to do, as it were, terrible things. And I feel Shakespeare is also very curious about the process by which, I guess for me, it's also related to conscience. And I feel like Shakespeare's curious about conscience. What is the strange voice in us that says, actually, stop? And I feel like later, someone mentioned Iago, it's like he's going to get to a place with Iago where there is zero conscience. Because even with Richard, I think later I'm so sorry I'm catching up on the play, but I think there's a moment later in the play when even Richard says, conscience has arrived in me, and I'm beginning to realize that what I've done is wrong.
Acts 5:3, Gregg just motioned with his hand.
And I find, anyway, that's perhaps a separate discussion, but I think it's another thing that again, we're thinking about with our leaders in that list that Chuk described early on of the tyrants or the despots of our age. What is their relationship to conscience? How do they, as it were, sleep at night? But sorry, Drew, back to you and to Hester and to Chuk.
And there was actually someone mentioning, here I found it, a comment from Terry adding a postscript to Chuk's comment that Stalin's rise was not seen because he was quietly building his influence as a party member in charge of making placements in the party and the government. He did not make speeches about how clever he was. Although, I mean, we can talk about the death of Stalin and the rise and death of Stalin, but what seems interesting here is the idea of conscience and consciencelessness.
I think it's really interesting. Sorry, Hester, you probably should go first. You haven't spoken in a while. I want to hear you talk about this, and I'll jump in after you.
Great, Hester. A little conscience in Shakespeare, Hester. There we go. And then I'd love to hear Chuk.
I think I'd like to take it back to soliloquy and the way in which we see Shakespeare experimenting with what you can do in a soliloquy here. Is it a confession? Is it a thinking through? It's not just I'm thinking aloud. A soliloquy is at once intimate and intensely artificial. and that sense of working through, we take for granted because we think, well, we know Hamlet, we know Othello, we know Macbeth. But here, there is that sense of, well, what does it mean to have this intimate engagement with a mind? And it can be quite frightening. And when that mind is discovering that it doesn't know where the line might be drawn, where it is abandoning the apparatus of family, of love, of relationships, of any kind of claim of friendship. And he's telling us all about it. I think that's a very frightening but wonderfully successful technique for a dramatist to be playing with. He'll refine it over the next 10 years. But here we see that thinking through, that experimentation in the way it's written, as well as in what it's actually saying. So that's not really about conscience, but it's about the thinking aloud and the reasoning aspect of it a little.
I also think that Coriolanus says, "Me alone make you a sword of me." There's something about when these outsiders, difficult people, own the fact that they're alone in Shakespeare. You know, there he is about to rush into battle, and he just says, and of course there are a million different interpretations of what that "me alone," it could be the logical "me alone make you so," or that's his existential moment going, "Me alone." And I feel that Richard, like, you know, Coriolanus in that sense, to cut through the weight of conscience and society and the questioning, there has to come a point where you see yourself alone as an island. And it's addressed in Hamlet when he says, "Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all, and enterprises of great pitch and moment in this regard lose the name of action." So when conscience comes into it, we can't act. And he literally gives people like Richard and Coriolanus, difficult ones, I can't think of other ones, but I'm sure it's littered with it, a moment of using that word alone to mean whatever it means for them. That's my sort of link between conscience and being alone, you know.
And in a non-Christian sense, one thinks of Brutus when he says the interim between the thinking of a terrible deed and the doing of it is like a terrible phantasm or a dream. That this idea of how conscience gets in the way of action, and yet how action dooms us and sends us back into Christian despair or a state of nightmare, is something Shakespeare was fascinated by and sees at work in the world. And I think that, in a way, is an answer of a sort to this question about history and Shakespeare's relationship to the historical record versus his imaginative creation, which is that these plays are they're not meant to be taken literally, but they're deadly serious, if you know what I mean. They are not historical records, but they are reflections of something that is happening in the world. And you know, it's interesting, Hester, you were talking about how Richard can be seen as a chain of images in the play. And he is obsessed with two things, shadows and mirrors. He says, "Shine out, fair sun, that I may see my shadow as I pass." And he also calls for a mirror to see himself adorned. And these are reflections of himself. He wants to see himself reflected in the world. It has to do with his self-image, his identity as an outsider. He wants to make sure that he is not alone in the world. And yet other people don't reflect back to him the picture that he wants to see. So he keeps on trying to force them, and we see that with Lady Anne. It's an ahistorical scene. It has no reason for being in the play in terms of plot. And yet it tells us everything we need to know about the character of Richard, which, in other words, is what we need to know about the character of people who desire political power, those who want to control others. feel as if I'm rambling a bit here, but it is a fable that is incredibly rich and powerful.
I just want to pick up on some of those things because it's such a rich territory also about this aloneness. It makes me think of Stanislavski, who described this quality of public solitude. That this very strange thing about being an actor, you sort of have to be in a space alone, and yet you're in front of 1,000 people. It's like, how do you even begin to kind of square that? But I have a hunch that going back to that moment about Shakespeare as showman, was that he absolutely thought, I know, I've got 3,000 people in this open air stage. How am I going to absolutely get their attention? And I feel like, and again, you guys will let me know whether it wasn't a kind of invention of Shakespeare's or suddenly it feels like he really grabbed the soliloquy. It was fairly recent. This notion of, I know, I'll get a character to step forward, stop the action and say to an audience, look, this is what I'm thinking right now. And I think as a kind of commercial theatre tool, it's kind of unbeatable. And it also reminds me of Cicely Berry, who was a wonderful voice teacher at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And she would always say in the rehearsals that I spent with her, to the actors, when she would come in and watch them work, she would say, I'm not interested in what you feel. I'm interested in what you're thinking. And I think for us as actors, it's very interesting how we want to often embroider the soliloquist with a lot of feelings, when actually, Hester, as you say, the seductive power of actually how thoughts work, how a thought is a long thought or a short thought, but how one thought begets another is a very potent tool.
We have a question from, sorry, Hester.
I think it's interesting that at this moment in Shakespeare's career, he's also starting on the sonnets, and that sense of working through in a really repetitive form, a form of propositional logic. You know, here's a miniature idea, here's another version of that idea, and another one. And seeing that as feeding into how a soliloquy might work as well in that very intimate, thinky way. Sorry,
No, it's true, isn't it? There's not a ton of what you might call lyric poetry in the play, other than perhaps Clarence's dream in Act 1, Scene 4, but there is an awful lot of very persuasive rhetoric. And Richard seems like one of Shakespeare's best rhetoricians in terms of turning words inside out, convincing people in order to do things he wants them to do. Along those lines, a question from Bill, men are ruled by women is a line in the play. Can we discuss the male anxiety and the power of female speech in the play? Certainly, Margaret, who's a character we haven't talked about, and the other women in the play have powerful, rhetorical, kind of old-timey verse speeches. And a question from Jared, speaking of sinning against God, any thoughts regarding Richard's cynical use of religion in the play, particularly seen in the middle of the play when he uses two clergymen and a prayer book as props, pretending to be disinterested in the crowd, not unlike holding a Bible for a photo op in Lafayette Park. Just gonna leave that there.
I've always been drawn by the women in Richard III, and often in productions, they get cut quite a bit, especially that extraordinary scene when all the women are weeping. But masculine, Richard, up until that point, has won every argument. And then he comes to Elizabeth, and they have that incredible argument. And yes, he gets what he wants in the end. He gets her to agree to give his daughter, at least he thinks he gets what he wants. But when you look at how he would come back with Lady Anne and win her over to the point where he, has to go, whoa, was every woman in this humor wood, was that good? Or how he won arguments with just about everyone throughout the play, including Elizabeth. But finally, when she gets him, in that argument, he finally just goes, look, what is done is done. Sometimes we do bad things and then we have to repent. And I find that really extraordinary because I feel she's the only person in the play that through argument, through rhetoric, through argument, through rules of three and all those things we use, gets Richard to a place where he just makes plain threats. If you don't do this, I'll kill, you know what I mean? And I found that really extraordinary in the power of the women in that play. And whenever people which is often the trap because it's a starry role, Richard. Focus entirely and lose that story of loss. I mean, that's where the loss of the children is steeped in. That's the genocide. That's the worst part of power grabs. Henry VI says, when lions roar and battle for their dens, poor harmless lambs abide their enmity. So I feel the women are the conscience of the play, and in many ways, the power of repercussion and the power of accountability. And ultimately, I think, especially when you see how Richard soon after that has his conscience stream, and then his death, no great speech at his death, I think she emasculates him in our concept of masculinity with her power. So I've always found that's just that build, when they include them, build up to that encounter with Elizabeth, and then watching everything after is always fascinating. And I attribute a lot of that, at least symbolically, to those women.
It certainly does feel like, Hester, you have your hand raised, so I'll pass it on to you.
So I think this is also coming back to this question of historical sources. And the historical Margaret was dead at the time of the play's action. So Queen Margaret is actually a zombie. She's a brilliant dramatic device. She's this terrifying voice from the past. She's the widow of Henry VI. She's a monster, but she's even older than that. She speaks, I think, for the women at the crucifixion, the women of the Passion plays. She speaks for the lamenting, bereaved mothers in the medieval play of the Holy Innocents, when they say, "Where are our children?" She's the voice of the Trojan women, of Hecuba, Clytemnestra, of the Furies. This is a play that's full of curses. And the question that Margaret and the other women ask is, where are they? Ubi sunt in Latin. Where have they gone? It's the poetry of lamentation. When Shakespeare was writing that idea of the ubi sunt motif, where are they? It was often applied to the fall of Rome, the loss of classical learning. But it's also about, where are the heroes? Where are our loved ones? Who will depose Richard? Who is going to end the suffering and the madness? Where are the leaders? And all of those scenes of lamentation, which seem to be so personal, are also asking, as Chuk says, the biggest questions of the play. The women are forwarding that in a way that seems to be emotional, but actually it's deeply, deeply ethical and fiercely political.
And it feels like it's not accidental at all that Margaret's curse that she says in Act 1, Scene 3 structures the play. Richard thinks that he's in control of the action, but in fact, Margaret says, curse on you, you, and then those people die in exactly that order. And it's a very striking contrast that the men in the play who help Richard into power, like Hastings and Buckingham and Stanley, they all think everything's going to be fine. They're like, well, I'm just going to use Richard until I can get what's mine. And then as Hastings says, in the moment before they die, O momentary grace of mortal men, which we more look for than the grace of God. That we place our political enrichment and powers above the things that are going to live for eternity. And the women in the play are the ones pointing out the demon, the serpent, the person who is alone and who is acting without regard to others. So it's fascinating the way Shakespeare, as you say, Chuk, these characters are often cut, adumbrated in performance, but they are key to understanding the structure of the play and what the play actually means. That's not a question, sorry.
No, that's terrific. Whether Gregg has any thoughts on the kind of some of these questions, some of these, the female voice in the play.
No, I think Hester, everyone has said incredible things. I'm just trying to process all that. A lot of new information, so thank you. I will, if one thing that we did in in Teenage Dick, the adaptation of I'm always dissatisfied with the fact that Anne just disappears. So one thing that Mike Lew beautifully, brilliantly did is give Anne her moment. She reappears. But she basically has a soliloquy in front of the audience. I don't have it handy. Maybe when I'm off mic, I could grab it and read some. But I felt like that was very important to restore her, right, to this story, since she is such an integral part of Richard's rise and ultimate fall.
Yeah, I think there's one scene late in the play where Anne appears outside the tower and joins in lamentation for the two princes with, I think, Queen Elizabeth, but it's almost like it's a different character than the one we see in Act 1, Scene 2. So certainly Lady Anne is kind of a structuring absence in the play. She has this extraordinary scene, this wooing scene, and then she disappears. Well, we have reached the hour, the Shakespeare hour. I want to thank all of our guests, and thank you, Simon, and also remind everyone that next week we are kicking off our series of expanded discussions, starting with Shakespeare's life. Our guests will be Sir Jonathan Bate, actor Anthony Heald, and Dr. Lena Orlin of Georgetown. Simon, are there any last words you want to say?
Well, I think ubi sunt is what I'm taking one of the things I'm taking away tonight. And what an incredible phrase. It's just ringing through our hearts and minds right now. Ubi sunt. So I want to say a huge thanks to Chuk, to Gregg, to Hester. Thank you for staying up so late, Hester. And our best wishes to England, our best wishes to New York. My thanks to Drew, to the STC team that bring the show every night, every week. And of course, to all of you tuning in, listening, and sharing your questions and brilliant thoughts. See you next week.
Thank you.